We've always been told the Siberian Husky is a modern marvel, bred recently for companionship and harsh winters. But new evidence from ancient DNA proves that story is completely wrong. Scientists have now traced the Husky's lineage back 9,500 years, revealing that these dogs weren't just adapted for the snow, they were the machinery of survival for ancient humans, long before the breed as we know it even existed. In 2020, a landmark study published in Science, Sinding et al., 2020, fundamentally challenged our understanding, revealing that sled dog ancestry is far older than previously theorized. By comparing the DNA of modern dogs with fossils from Zhukov Island in Siberia, researchers found a line of ancestry that reached back about 9,500 years. That number matters because it pushes the origin of husky ancestors far beyond the time most people imagine. These were not simply later dogs adapted for snow. They were already pulling sleds for humans thousands of years ago, in a world where winter was not a season to admire, but a force that decided whether a community endured. The picture that emerges is unsettling if you have only ever seen the Siberian Husky as a sleek companion with piercing eyes and a thick coat. Long before the breed had a name, its ancestors were working in an Arctic landscape that demanded endurance, cooperation, and an almost impossible tolerance for cold. The fossil dogs from Zhukov Island do not just fill a gap in the timeline. They show that the relationship between northern people and their dogs was mature, functional, and deeply embedded in daily life far earlier than the popular story allows. That is what makes this discovery so powerful. It does not merely say that the Siberian Husky has old roots. It says those roots were active, practical, and already tied to sled pulling in the late Ice Age. The dog beside the sled was not an accessory to human settlement. It was part of the machinery of survival. And once that is understood, the modern Husky stops looking like a recent invention and starts looking like a living inheritance. There is also a quieter implication hiding inside that ancient DNA. If sled dogs were already present 9,500 years ago, then the traits we admire today, resistance, metabolism built for long effort, the ability to move through punishing terrain, were not added all at once by a modern breeder. They were carried forward through generations of Arctic life, preserved by necessity as much as by choice. The Siberian Husky, in that sense, is not just a breed with a history. It is a record of adaptation, and that changes the emotional weight of the story. What looked like a familiar working dog now carries the memory of people who depended on dogs to cross impossible distances, transport food, and stay alive where the cold never relented. Even the breed's beauty feels different after that. The bright coat, the focused stare, the lean power in motion, these are not decorative traits first, and functional traits second. They are echoes of a much older partnership. If you have ever assumed the Siberian Husky was simply a recent northern breed with a dramatic appearance, pause there, because the ancient DNA says otherwise. The line leading to today's Husky was already moving beside humans in Siberia roughly 9,500 years ago, and that fact turns a familiar dog into something far more remarkable. Follow this thread a little farther, and the next layer becomes even more revealing. The first thing that changed was not the dog's shape, but its family tree. For decades, the cleanest version of the story said, this working Arctic dog came from a fairly recent path of breeding and survival, shaped mainly by human hands and practical need. Then, in 2024, research co-led by Cornell University, published in Genome Biology and Evolution, Smith, Srikanth, and Huson 2024, shattered that singular narrative. According to Cornell Chronicle, the modern Siberian Husky descends from two distinct Arctic dog lineages, and its origin reaches back to northeastern Siberia, far earlier than most people had assumed. That detail matters because it does more than shift a date on a timeline. It changes the kind of history we are looking at. A single recent source would suggest a narrow beginning, almost like a breed assembled in one place and one era. Two lineages tell a different story entirely. They imply movement, overlap, inherited traits carried across generations, and a long process in which northern dogs were already diversifying before the modern image of the breed ever took shape. And once that possibility appears, the old explanation starts to feel too small. The familiar white and grey outline, the endurance, the alert expression, the economy of motion in deep snow, none of that now looks like a surface-level design created in one sweep. It begins to resemble the visible end of an older genetic conversation, one that had already been unfolding in the Arctic, long before the breed became known to the wider world. Cornell's finding is especially important because it does not describe a vague resemblance. It points to ancestry, to a real biological split beneath the appearance people recognize so easily. In practical terms, that means the dog pulling a sled today is carrying more than a useful working form. It is carrying a record of distinct northern populations that converged in a harsh environment and remained tied to human survival in that region. That is why the new evidence feels so disruptive. The Husky was never simply a modern northern dog with a cold-weather coat and a talent for labor. Its story now reaches into an older Arctic landscape, one where dogs were already adapting in parallel, and where isolation, travel, and necessity preserved differences instead of erasing them. There is also a quieter implication hidden inside the science. If the lineage is older and more mixed than expected, then the dog's identity is not just about strength or speed. It is about continuity. It suggests that communities in northeastern Siberia were keeping alive a living partnership with animals whose ancestry had already been shaped by extreme conditions. That partnership did not begin with a fashionable breed standard. It began with survival. So the question is no longer whether this dog was built for cold. The harder question is how deep that cold runs in its ancestry, and how much of what we call a modern breed is actually the result of ancient northern lines surviving, blending, and being carried forward. Cornell's 2024 research does not close that question. It opens it wider, and the answer becomes stranger the longer you look. If this shift surprises you, stay with it, because the next layer goes beyond ancestry alone, and shows why the Husky's body, movement, and resilience make sense only when viewed through that much older Arctic inheritance. Then, the evidence stops feeling distant. This 9,500-year-old Zhukov Island fossil, found alongside the world's oldest sled artifacts, shares a major portion of its genome with modern Siberian Huskies, Sinding et al., 2020. That is a hard sentence to ignore, because it shifts the story from shared Arctic habits to real inherited continuity. The significance is in the specificity. Zhukov Island is not a poetic placeholder for the far north. It is a concrete place tied to a concrete sample, one that survived long enough to be read against living bloodlines. When that comparison was made, the old assumption that the breed could be explained mostly through recent working history began to lose ground. The connection was no longer only about dogs built for snow, endurance, and sled work. It was about a lineage that appears to have passed through time without breaking. That changes the way every familiar trait is read. The steady pull, the compact power, the cold-resistant body, the alertness that makes a Siberian Husky seem almost tuned to winter itself. These features stop looking like last-minute solutions and start looking like inherited memory. The animal on Zhukov Island had already carried a version of that inheritance 9,500 years ago, long before the breed was ever recognized in the form people know now. And that is where the tension deepens. If so much of the genome is still shared, then the question is no longer whether these dogs adapted to the north. Of course they did. The deeper question is, how much of the lineage remained intact while human groups moved, split, and depended on them in places where one mistake could mean death? A living pattern like that does not survive by accident. It survives because it is useful, trusted, and repeatedly chosen. Futurity's report on the 2020 analysis made that point unmistakable by tying the ancient sample to the present breed in genetic terms, not just in atmosphere or legend. That matters because legend can flatter the imagination, but DNA is less forgiving. It does not care how elegant a story sounds. It only shows what was carried forward. So the image of the Siberian Husky changes again. What looked like a polished modern breed now appears as the visible edge of a much older chain, one that reaches back to a dog from Zhukov Island, and forward into every team that still drives across snow with that same fierce, controlled energy. The surprise is not only that the connection exists, it is that the connection is close enough to be measured. If this makes the breed feel older, it should. The next layer becomes even more unsettling, because once the link to the past is visible, the body itself starts to make sense in a way that pure breeding history never fully explained. The first thing the new analysis made impossible was comfort. For years, the familiar outline of the Siberian Husky seemed to settle the matter. One northern type, one working legacy, One story of cold and endurance passed cleanly from past to present. But in 2024, a study published in Genome Biology and Evolution pulled that certainty apart. The researchers found that modern Siberian Huskies are genetically farther from American and Eurasian Siberian Huskies than many people had assumed, and that gap pointed toward a much older beginning for sled dogs, one rooted in the late Pleistocene. That detail matters because it changes the question. It is no longer just about where the breed was shaped by people. It is about how much of its history was already ancient, before anyone started sorting dogs into the categories we recognize now. The result from Oxford Academic does not simply add another date to the timeline. It suggests that the line connecting present-day dogs to their northern ancestors is uneven, layered and older than the tidy breed stories told for so long. Once that becomes visible, the familiar comparisons lose their ease. A Siberian Husky standing beside other dogs from the north may still look like part of the same family, but the genome says otherwise. The resemblance is real, yet it hides distance. Some of the traits that seem shared across sled dogs may come from a deep Arctic past, while the specific modern population carries its own path, shaped by separation, survival, and repeated human choice. That is the unsettling part of the 2024 finding. It does not erase the older evidence, it sharpens it. The Zhukov Island sample, the ancient continuity, the endurance built for frozen terrain, all of it remains in place. What changes is the frame around it. The Husky is not just a surviving breed with an old origin story. It is a branch of a much wider sled dog history. And even inside that branch, the distances are larger than anyone expected. In practical terms, the study published by Oxford Academic helps explain why the breed feels so singular in motion and in metabolism. The body is carrying history that was never fully flattened by recent breeding. A dog can be selected for appearance, speed, or temperament, but deep ancestry leaves a quieter signature. It shows up in the way a team moves across snow, in the stamina that seems almost too efficient, and in the strange consistency of a form that has endured pressure from climate, geography, and human demands. What this newer layer also kills is the idea that the breed story can be read from one kennel, one country, or one century. The comparison with American and Eurasian Siberian Huskies proves that the name alone is not enough. Under the same label, there are differences that reveal how far back the trail really runs. The dogs are related, yes, but the relationship is not as close as the surface suggests, and the oldest roots stretch deeper than the recent history of registered lines. So the truth becomes harder and far more interesting. The Siberian Husky is not only a relic of Arctic work, it is the visible outcome of a long inheritance that survived when climates changed, people moved, and some branches thinned while others remained useful enough to keep. Even now the breed carries that tension in its body, familiar to the eye, older than the eye can measure. If you want to understand what the studies have truly taken apart, it is the comforting myth of a simple origin. What remains instead is a layered ancestry, one confirmed by 2024 genetics, anchored by late Pleistocene sled dog history, and still visible in the living animal that pulls forward as if memory itself were part of the muscle. On the rivers, the truth was written in motion. A dog that could not read ice, snow, current, and distance would vanish quickly in the far north. But the Siberian Husky endured because its work was more than pulling. It was survival shaped into habit. That detail matters, because function leaves traces where appearances only mislead. A body built for hauling loads across frozen waterways does not emerge overnight, and it does not stay useful for centuries by accident. That is why the 2024 analysis in Genome Biology and Evolution, published through Oxford Academic, changed the conversation again. The researchers found that modern Siberian Huskies are genetically farther from American Siberian Huskies and Eurasian Siberian Huskies than anyone had expected. The result did not simply separate one line from another. It pushed the story back into older ground, towards sled dog ancestry that reaches to the end of the Pleistocene. In other words, the animal's job was not a late invention added onto a recent breed. The job itself is part of the evidence that the lineage is old. Once that becomes clear, the rivers and the ice stop looking like scenery and start looking like archives. A team of dogs moving over frozen channels needed endurance, heat conservation, traction, and the instinct to keep going when a human trail disappeared under wind. Those traits were not ornamental. They were selected again and again because communities depended on them. The result was a working partnership so tight that the animal's biology, over generations, kept answering the demands of travel in one of Earth's harshest environments. And that is the deeper layer now emerging. The Siberian Husky was not first defined by show rings, modern labels, or the polished language of breed history. It was held in place by usefulness, by rivers, by ice, by the long pressure of a world where failing once could cost lives. The 2024 finding does not erase the earlier ancestry already traced through ancient DNA. It sharpens it, showing that the modern breed sits farther from some named husky populations than its image suggests, while the working line itself belongs to a much older Arctic logic. So the dog's strength begins to look less like a modern trait and more like inherited memory. Every frozen crossing, every loaded sled, every winter path cut across white ground became a filter that kept the right bodies, the right feet, the right lungs, the right temperament. That is how a function can outlast a century and still point to a much older beginning. If this story is pulling you in the way it pulled me, stay with it. Because the next question is not only where the Siberian Husky came from, but why its working body preserved a history that documents alone could not see. And once that question opens, the breed stops being a symbol and becomes a witness. Then the story shifts again, and this time the shift is harder to ignore. In 2024, a paper in Genome Biology and Evolution, published through Oxford Academic, reported something that made the old picture feel too neat to survive. Modern Siberian Huskies are genetically more distant from American and Eurasian Huskies than anyone had assumed. Not visually distant, not just different in coat or build, genetically distant, in a way that points to a much older separation than the modern label suggests. That matters because it changes the problem itself. For years, people looked at these dogs and saw one Arctic type, one working silhouette, one familiar answer repeated in different places. But the genetic evidence tells a stranger story. The Husky family does not sit on a single straight line. It branches. It carries more than one old current inside it. And when those currents are traced backward, they lead toward two distinct Arctic lineages, both ancient, both shaped by cold, both preserved by human dependence, but not identical. Suddenly, the resemblance between working dogs starts to look less like proof of one origin and more like the surface effect of shared survival. Two lineages can arrive at similar bodies when the same wind, snow, hunger, and distance keep pressing on them for generations. Narrow ears, dense coats, endurance over speed, feet that can keep moving when the ground turns hard and white. Those traits do not need a single moment of invention. They can emerge from a long conversation between geography and selection until history writes the same answer twice. That is the deeper twist inside the 2024 finding. It does not simply say the Siberian Husky is old. It says the breed preserves multiple layers of oldness at once. One layer links it to long Arctic ancestry. Another layer reveals that present-day Huskies are not all standing on the same genetic ground. Some branches stayed closer together than others. Some drifted. Some were held apart by movement, exchange, and the practical decisions of people who cared less about purity than about whether a dog could still pull, travel, and survive. And that is where the familiar image becomes more interesting. A Siberian Husky, seen in motion, may appear to belong to one uninterrupted tradition, but its genome carries a record of divergence inside the tradition itself. The dog is not just a survivor of the North. It is a survivor of more than one northern past, folded into a single present-day body. In that sense, the breed becomes a living archive, not a simple relic, but a collection of older solutions kept active by necessity. If you feel the ground moving under that idea, stay with it, because the next layer is even more revealing. Once two ancient lines are recognized inside the same story, the question is no longer whether the Siberian Husky is old. It is how those lines were held together long enough to create the dog we recognize now, and why the modern breed still carries the marks of that hidden split. The answer explains not only ancestry, but identity. What looked like a simple mark of beauty turned out to be a genetic clue hiding in plain sight. For years, the pale blue eyes of a Siberian Husky were treated like a dramatic accident of appearance, the kind of feature people admired without asking where it came from. Then, in 2018, a study published in PLOS Genetics, Boyko and Sams, 2018, provided a breakthrough. Researchers identified a 98.6 kb duplication near the ALX4 gene as the causal variant for blue eyes. Suddenly, a trait that seemed almost poetic had a measurable biological cause. That matters, because it changes how the breed is seen. The Husky was never only about endurance in snow or a hard body built for work. Even the face was carrying history. Those eyes, bright against the mask and fur, were not just decoration. They were part of a larger pattern in which modern genetics could read both the hidden past and the visible present. The same science that pushed the breed's roots deeper into Arctic time was also able to explain why some Huskies seem to look back at us with that unmistakable icy color. And the detail is more important than it first appears. A mutation does not mean the whole breed was invented by a single event. It means one visible signature can be traced, isolated, and understood without reducing the animal to a stereotype. In other words, the blue eye does not replace the ancient lineage we already uncovered. It adds another layer. The Husky becomes easier to admire, but harder to simplify. Behind the flash of color is a living record of selection, inheritance, and chance. That is what makes the modern picture so unsettling and so rich at the same time. People often imagine that science strips mystery away. Here it does the opposite. The closer the lens gets, the more the Siberian Husky refuses to be reduced to a single story. Its body points toward long survival in the north. Its eyes point toward a specific mutation tracked by contemporary genomics. One tells of endurance across generations. The other tells of a distinct visual signature made legible by a 2018 study in Nature. Together they show a breed shaped not only by cold, movement, and human need, but by details so small they could have been overlooked forever. If you have ever watched a Siberian Husky standing still in winter light, you know how impossible that gaze can feel. It seems ancient and immediate at once. Now we know why that feeling is so persistent. The breed is not merely carrying an old origin in its bones, it is also carrying a newly mapped visual code on its face, and that combination is what makes the dog feel larger than its size. The deeper the genetics goes, the less ordinary the animal becomes. What comes next is where the story turns from trait to legacy. Because once a visible feature can be pinned to a mutation, the question is no longer just how the Husky looks, but why so many of its defining signs survived at all. The answer lies in the people who kept these dogs close, the environments that rewarded difference, and the long chain of choices that allowed a northern worker to remain recognizable across time. Subscribe if you want to follow that next layer, because the final meaning of the Siberian Husky is not only that it endured, but that it preserved enough of its past for science to read it back into the present. By now, the old picture has fallen apart. The Siberian Husky was never just a polished modern breed that happened to fit the snow. It carried a deeper inheritance, one that survived because cold, distance, and human dependence kept selecting for the dogs that could endure. But the strongest conclusion science can defend today is not a neat ending. It is a boundary. In 2024, a study published in Genome Biology and Evolution through Oxford Academic showed that modern Siberian Huskies are genetically more distant from American and Eurasian Siberian Huskies than people had assumed. That finding matters because it pushes the timeline back again towards sled dogs that were already diverging in the late Pleistocene. In other words, the line we now call the Siberian Husky does not begin with a recent kennel story or a narrow moment of breeding. It reaches into a far older Arctic world where function, migration, and survival were shaping dogs long before the modern name existed. That does not mean the puzzle is fully solved. It means the puzzle is larger than the name. The available evidence now points to an ancient, hybrid, and highly functional origin, but the exact relationship between Siberian Huskies and other Arctic dogs is still partly open. Some links are clear, others remain blurred by time, movement, and the fact that northern dogs were never isolated museum pieces. They traveled with people. They changed with people. They were preserved by people who needed them alive, not perfect. That is why the Siberian Husky feels so unsettlingly complete when you look at it. Even though part of its origin remains unfinished, the endurance in its body, the economy of its movement, the way it still seems designed for a world of ice and wind, all of it now reads less like a modern invention and more like a surviving fragment of a much older Arctic continuity. The dog did not merely inherit a job, It inherited a history of adaptation that was strong enough to cross millennia. And yet the most honest answer is still the most human one. We know more now, but not everything. Ancient DNA has given the Siberian Husky a deeper past than legend allowed, and it has shown that the breed's roots are older than a simple recent origin story could explain. Still, the full map of its kinship with other northern dogs is not complete. There is more distance, more branching, and more hidden connection than the old image ever suggested. So the final meaning of the Siberian Husky is not that science closed the case. It is that science restored scale. What looked like a familiar working dog turns out to be a living archive of Arctic survival, shaped by human necessity and preserved by generations that never had the language of genetics, but understood continuity in the only way that mattered, by keeping the right dogs at their side. If this deeper history stayed with you, stay close to the next one, because the Arctic still keeps its secrets in plain sight, and the dogs that crossed its ice may reveal even more than we are ready to name.